hey, the system of Reiki is from Japan, so what's happening in Japan?
How do we engage a person's senses, their body, their minds, their heart, their spirit in a way that they can be with these teachings? Welcome, friends, to the Reiki Women podcast, an exploration into the profound depths of the system of Reiki from a Japanese spiritual perspective and how that relates to our modern lives.
We are keeping it real to Reiki's origins, challenging the New Age stereotype that things like crystals, chakras, and angels are authentic aspects of the system. I'm Bronwen Logan, and when I'm not writing best-selling books about the Japanese system of Reiki, 75,000 readers and counting, I'm here debunking outmoded Reiki myths and coaching individuals and groups through my website, Reiki with Bronwen.
And I'm Michaela Daystar, lead teacher and weaver of Heartscapes Reiki, connecting the dots between Reiki and environmental and social justice, because our individual healing cannot be extracted from healing relationship with the collective and with the land.
And I'm Carrie Varela from the Reiki Healing Society, here to help you transform your Reiki practice into a thriving, prosperous business. Because while passion fuels your purpose, it's time to make it sustainable, authentic, and beautifully you. We're three women diving into the heart of Japanese Reiki. We're building a community that centers women's voices and inspires well-being. We're not just for women, we're for everybody. Come join the conversation.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to Reiki Women podcast. Bronwen and I are here, just the two of us today. Carrie is off flying with the fairies and unicorns somewhere out there in the world. And we thought we would just have a little bit of a chitty chat, a little bit of a thought exercise that was inspired by maybe what might even be considered an offhand comment, or at least a tiny snippet from an article, an interview that was done by William Lee Rand with Hiroshi Doi and is published on Reiki.org. We'll put that link down below, somewhere around 2014. And in this conversation, Hiroshi Doi mentioned that according to the Reiki Ryoho Gakkai, which is the association that holds the teachings of Mikao Usui and the system of Reiki in Japan, that Usui considered Shoden and Okuden, Reiki 1 and 2, as we understand them now, to be the complete teachings of the system of Reiki. That Reiki 3 or Shimpiden had quite a different function for the life of a practitioner, and that Reiki 1 and 2, Shoden and Okuden, contained the complete teachings. And that sparked some thoughts and some interesting exchange that we thought we might as well share with all you. So that is what we are circling up about. Is Reiki 1 and 2 the complete teachings of the system of Reiki? How have we experienced them, and what might we gather from that? Take it away, Bronwen.
I was sort of intrigued by this idea because in some ways I found it to be something that in some part of my brain, I think that too, right? So I was really curious why. And I always say Shimpiden's not about learning more things. It's really more about going more deeply into what it is that we've already studied. So, look, I'll just read you what he said. He said, the whole course of Reiki healing is taught in Shoden and Okuden. So Shoden is Japanese for beginner teachings, that's Reiki 1, and Okuden is the inner teachings, and that's Reiki 2. They do sometimes break them up, because then he wrote, when a member is given Okuden Koki, which is the second half of Okuden, so they break Okuden up, he or she is recognized as having completed the entire course of Usui Reiki healing. And then he says, however, while the task of performing Reiju, so that's the Japanese attunement, while the task of performing Reiju is done by the Shihan, and that's the Shimpiden title holder. So Shihan is teacher, yeah. Some of those who were Okuden Koki and in charge of local branches of the Gakkai, so the association, were also taught Reiju, and they offered this to the students of the branch. This took place only if the local branch didn't have a Shihan, a teacher. So the teachers would travel around from place to place. Today, however, the teacher is the only one who will give Reiju, and not someone who's just running the group, but an actual Shihan. I think it's really fascinating, and I really love the idea. And if you think about it, we've got beginner teachings, and then we've got inner teachings. And really, what more do you need? Yeah, that sounds really fantastic. It's like first we learn the things, we're beginners. Well, we're always beginners, but we are starting off learning these things. And then we move into, with the inner teachings, just finding out more about them in depth. Another thing that he says is that there was no symbol for and mantra. And that's sort of in line with this idea of that you're not learning new things. So symbol 1 and its mantra, symbol 2 and its mantra, symbol 3 and its mantra were all that we needed. And I like that too, because I always relate them to Earth being symbol 1, symbol 2 being the heavens, and symbol 3 being the heart and being that connection. It's that whole of us. It is that interconnected us. And what more do we need? It's us being interconnected with the universe, which has the earth, the heavens, and life. I can really picture this and see this. I didn't read it in this particular article, but I had heard at another time that Hiroshi Doi had said that symbol 4 and the mantra were actually shown to the Shimpoden students. So it wasn't that it didn't exist, but it wasn't taught in the same way that we would teach the first 3. Yeah. So more something to think about. And if you think about, symbol 4 is reflective of the whole teachings, and that is, where are we headed? Why are we practicing? And we're practicing to become the great bright light.
Yeah.
Oh, so much in that.
So much in that. Yeah. And this is one of these juicy, messy places where the understandings and the worldview of Japanese Reiki in its original form, from its original context, which you and I have studied for quite some time, and yet we are still looking at it from the outside and from a Western context in this year 2025. And then the Western forms, which have such a radically different worldview oftentimes. And oftentimes there's these clashes. And these, if we look at that, if we think about what is the purpose of these classes, we see that's one of these places where the worldview is different. From a Western perspective, we hold it in a Western context, which often sees learning as progressive and linear, that you start with kindergarten and maybe you end with a PhD, or maybe you end with a master's degree, maybe you end up with a bachelor's degree, maybe you graduate high school, but whatever the case is, there's a beginning point and an end point, and there's progression between those points. And the goal is to get to the end point, right? Probably as fast as you can, get through there. Hopefully you have some good experiences along the way. And that there is a celebration of reaching that end point, right? You take on a status when you reach that end point, whether or not you did well in your classes, whether or not you remember anything you learned, whether or not you're working in a field that's related to your studies. And I think we import that into something like the system of Reiki, where fast tracking to Reiki 3 so that you can take on that master title, for some people in some contexts, is almost more of the goal, or at least it's how the goal is defined, than having a deep experience, having a whole practice at every step along the way. Obviously, I'm generalizing. This is not how everybody holds it. But I think, generally speaking, I have seen the way in which we conceptualize Reiki 1, 2, and 3 in the same way, that the goal is to complete level 3, possibly as quickly as possible, and that confers some level of status. In the original form, the purpose is to have a direct experience with mystery, with self, with connection, right? To reintegrate the parts of ourselves so we can experience ourselves as a whole being that is networked in with life. It's entirely about our direct experience with ourselves, each other, and the world. And in that sense, if we look at what's contained inside of Shoden and inside of Okuden, the practices, the perspectives, the particular learning, the way in which they get stacked on each other to build more complete versions of themselves. I completely agree that a deep and thorough examination of Shoden and Okuden brings us to a incredibly holistic and complete practice. Everything that we need to be deeply engaged with the system of Reiki and therefore with life itself. So then if we look at the purpose of Shimpiden, from what you just read and described, we can see that it's more about a change in the identity and the status of the practitioner than it is about necessarily deepening their own practice. The assumption is that they already have achieved an incredible depth of practice, that you probably are not experiencing Shinpiden learning a few weeks after you completed your Okuden, right? There's probably a gap of time there where you have achieved some level of depth in your practice. And then it's about how do I as a practitioner and maybe a teacher relate to my community? How do I hold these teachings and distribute them, and in what contexts and under whose authority? And if we look at symbol 4 and mantra 4, the great bright light, right? This is describing the experience of Reiki, right? And so it's saying this is what you should already be familiar with through your practice, right? And here it is in a distilled form. When I think about my own practice and my own teaching, which is very much a hybrid of me as a white Western American person in the 2020s, practicing this art form as closely as I can to its origins, but of course inside of this context. And I think about my thought process in designing my own Shoden, Okuden, Shimpiden. I can really feel this truth, right? That when it came to Shimpiden, I was like, so what is this about, right? Because I don't subscribe to the idea that I can confer mastery on my students. That's up to them to develop mastery through their practice. So taking the class doesn't give them mastery. Okay, they can learn the Reiju. So now they can work with others in a more in-depth way, in a way that helps them learn. So that's very similar to what we just discussed as far as the status change in what a practitioner can hold for other people. The other piece, though, is learning more about the esoteric roots of the system of Reiki, those things that are outside of the system of Reiki, but that inform it. Things like the Heart Sutra, like working with Furomyo and his mantra, like all of the kind of mantras that are part of Tendai and why did the word just go right out of my brain?
Shintoism,
But the other Japanese Buddhism, which is the one that I actually
Oh,
practice.
Shigendo.
Nope, we're still not hitting it. It's going to come to me in a complete random moment. Shingon Buddhism. So things of that nature are what I have chosen to infuse into my Shimpiden. But those are not the system of Reiki, right? Yeah. Those are practices that are taken from the long-standing traditions that form the foundation of the system of Reiki. In the context of a Japanese person learning Reiki, those things would already be part of their consciousness. Those things would already be somewhere in their lived experience, most likely, at least in the general, but for many people in the specific, right? They would have perhaps already experienced going to Buddhist services and chanting the Heart Sutra, for example. So that level of, okay, let's engage in this foundation that is not Reiki, but that is the bedrock of it, would be unnecessary in that context. I'm guessing. This is my supposition. So yeah, so that's just kind of, again, thinking through how do I hold these classes and how do I talk about them in terms of completeness? And I agree in kind of reflecting that Shoden and Okuden, when engaged deeply, provide us with an absolute, complete, and holistic practice that can carry us as long as we want to go. Shimpiden then becomes this playground almost to kind of engage in other aspects of culture and of spirituality that are for a Western practitioner, incredibly informative to step into this practice more thoroughly, but perhaps unnecessary in its original context.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. I should have started actually telling a little bit of a history of Hiroshi Doi, because that,
Yeah, please.
well, just that Hiroshi Doi, I'm not sure, I think he's 80 something, yeah, now. And
right.
so he first started teaching the system of Reiki in Japan from a very Western perspective. And in fact, he does say he teaches something now called Gendai Reiki, which is actually based upon Osho Reiki. And Osho was a mystic who lived in India. And there were big communes that he had there that people would come from all over the world and study with him. And there's good stories about him and there's bad stories about him. So anyway, there was a form of Reiki practice that a student from Osho created. And that is actually what Hiroshi Doi has based his teachings upon. So he sort of blends Western and Japanese. Now, his Japanese influence is when all these people in the West started saying, hey, the system of Reiki is from Japan. So what's happening in Japan? He started researching in Japan and he became a member of the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai. So the association that Usui is said to have created back in 1922 in Japan. He became a member, but they had a rule. And the rule was that you weren't allowed to talk about what you learnt inside the association with anyone else. So that was difficult. But now...
The rule of Reiki Club is you don't talk about Reiki Club? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. However, that has changed. And he was given permission to actually talk about it. So he became this sort of middle person. And that's why this article, for example, exists. Because, as he said, he's been fortunate enough to be able to speak about what they do in the association. And that has really informed us fantastically about what we can learn about the system of Reiki from Japan. So that's sort of interesting. Another interesting thing that I thought was Mrs. Yamaguchi, and I met Mrs. Yamaguchi. She's now passed on, but she was taught by Hayashi, Shujiro Hayashi, so a student of Usui, and she was, I can't think how old, she was 80-something when I met her, and she didn't know the last symbol, the fourth symbol of mantra. And there was a lot of confusion in the world at this time, because that was the early 2000s that we found that out, and that's before we knew this information, which Hiroshi Doi has shared. And there was a lot of talk about, oh, then she never became a Shinpuden teacher. However, when she was 19 years old, her uncle, who was a Reiki practitioner, taught her how to do the Reiju because there was a meeting happening and they needed more people to do the Reiju, the attunement. At the time, I'm thinking, this is just so weird. You haven't done Shinpuden, you're asked to do Reiju. How does this all work? I didn't know how to put that together in my head. Reading this, it makes so much sense. And that is that if they didn't have enough people, they'd just get someone else to do it, which is just hilarious. And it really supports for me this idea there are no rules in the system of Reiki. Mikao Usui was a teacher. And we've seen that because of the recently found information from Taiwan, where he's written in his own handwriting his CV up until... what date was it? Now I've forgotten. But I think it was 1903. I think it was up to the age of 39. He had a lot of experience running schools, being a teacher. So this setup of Shoden and Okuden, teaching everything, and this sort of pathway made a lot of sense to set something like that up to help people and to give them different ways of learning. I mean, I love that about the system, that we have all these different meditations or mantras or symbols and the precepts and chanting the precepts. So all these different ways of working and the poetry. The Gakkai, by the way, still today work with the poetry, just so you guys all know that. And I do like that. Yeah, so we know that he set up this teaching system. What Hiroshi Doi said is that you would study for about 10 years before you could be considered to move into the space of head Shihan and be Shinpuden. That is a long time, 10 years. In our Reiki world, we don't really take that long. But once again, no rules. It would really be, I think, people just learning, moving through, and it sounds to me quite organic.
Yeah. Well, and there's also this completely different framework for learning that I think we in the West have a hard time wrapping our mind around, which is apprenticeship. And the idea that, yes,
Oh, yeah.
there was these kind of the first teachings, the Shoden, here's the entry point, and this is kind of what it means to be a beginning student, and then here's these inner teachings. So there's these groupings of teachings that you progress through. But certainly in Usui's time and before, you would have much more individualized learning, much more the teacher meeting
Oh,
the student
yeah.
where they are and the student progressing at the pace that they are meant to, as opposed to an entire class being like brought at the same pace from here to here and then from here to there. And so the idea that somebody who's very young, who's obviously raised with a family that has this tradition, that's probably been steeped in it for a long time, that has gone through inner teachings, would be tapped to hold the space for other people to come on board, even if they have not been through that final piece of attaining the Shihan status, that there would be more fluidity and more of a meeting a person where they are. Are you ready to take this on, whether or not you've done XYZ, versus, okay, I have a certificate that says I am a Reiki master and
Yeah.
therefore I can do
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
would be my guess.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Another thing that I liked about this article, and I noticed it recently when I was reading through the book by Kaji Tomita, who was a student of Usui's, is that they never call the system just Reiki.
They call it the system of Reiki.
They don't necessarily say the system of Reiki. They'll say Reiki healing, right? Or Usui's system. And it's never just Reiki because it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to them because they're Japanese. And it's like,
Reiki
yeah,
is a phenomenon. It's not an activity.
exactly. So they never, ever say that. And
Yeah.
I think we can really learn from that because if we can understand the differences between energy and a practice, then our own learning is going to be a lot deeper and we'll be able to find answers to things a lot more easily rather than, I think there's a lot of confusion in the system of Reiki or in the Western world specifically with that because of that misunderstanding. And there's one other thing that he does mention, which is super interesting. I mean, we already know that, those of us who teach in the Japanese style or way, and that is that the Reiju that is taught, there's only ever one Reiju. There are not Reiju for different levels. It's just one particular practice. He says, as a quote, Reiju is the method to let the internal Reiki of the person get tuned into the universal Reiki. So it's helping us to sense that or come back into that space of interconnectedness with everything. And I love that. So there's no Reiju for the beginners, Reiju for advanced learners, or Reiju for Shimpuden. It's just
I
Reiju.
love that.
Yeah.
I love that. I also love, I mean, I am essentially, my vocational identity is as a teacher. Every job I've ever had back to when I was 19, whatever the topic of the job was, the role I ended up taking involved teaching.
Yeah.
It's really who I am. And I love designing curriculum and I love figuring out how to engage different types of learners and how to, you know, help people have that experience. Just love it. Freaking love it. And teaching teachers is one of my favorite things to teach. So I'm working with 3 Reiki teaching apprentices right now. We just met today. It's so much fun. But the reason I'm saying that is I love this deeper insight that we got through this discovery of Mikao Usui's curriculum vitae,
Yeah.
written back in the 19 or early 1900s, which we should probably deep dive on another episode. But
Oh, I'd love to do that.
this revelation that we always kind of understood him to be a little bit of a jack of all trades, kind of dabbled in, studied law and did a bit of this and a bit of government and a bit of trade and a bit of whatever. But to really see across the history of his professional life, this theme of teacher coming back again and again, and then school administrator. And so it makes a lot of sense that there is such a coherence to Shoden and Okuden and Shippuden, and the way in which all of the different ways of learning and the different ways of absorbing a concept are engaged so meticulously in the elements and practices that we receive in that. And that what is also said is that originally the practice was such an internal one, such a meditative one, and it was one that came out of his lifetime of engagement with these esoteric foundations, this bedrock. But when approaching people who maybe have not been for 25 years and does 21-day meditations on the mountain with nature teaching you directly, if that's not the life you're living, how do we engage a person's senses, their body, their mind, their heart, their spirit in a way that they can be with these teachings, right? And we see that, and we see it in such a coherent unfolding when we look at the way Shoden and Okuden is designed. And I've always said that Okuden is my favorite class to teach. I love all of them, but absolutely is my favorite class to teach. And this conversation is helping me to understand another layer of why that is. It's because in Okuden, if students have been diligently in their practice and they've been engaging, they do come into a level of completeness with their practice. Like there is a and now you have it. Now you have the system, right? And that Shippuden becomes this other intention, this other space to inhabit.
Yeah.
And I adore bringing in all of the esoteric practices there too. But again, I can understand why those weren't even really the point originally, because that would have just been part of the air people were breathing.
Just in a separate note to that, and it was something that you mentioned when you saw the curriculum vitae of Usui, that the Christian history, because he has been called a missionary, and I always wondered, what does that mean, being a missionary? And to me, that seems such a Christian thing. We should do a deeper dive into this one as well, because recently I read a piece which was a recording of Hawaii Takata telling this incredibly long, detailed story about the life of Mikao Usui. And it really was detailed. And I'm thinking, where did she get all that detail from? I do think she was a good storyteller. But her thing really was that he was a serious Christian.
Interesting.
And looking at his CV, he could very well have been a serious Christian. See, the thing is, Japan is just very syncretic. Yeah. So it does this. It really blends things. And just because you might go to a Christian church doesn't mean that you can't have a Buddhist understanding about something or have a Shinto altar at home.
Right.
And
well, and of course, he was growing up in a time when Japan was opening to the West for the first time.
So exciting.
So how exciting would that be, right? And to learn that he spent time in San Francisco, which I'm like, I was born in San Francisco, so I love I love that connection. So he came here, he spent time here, and was probably really enlivened by, as a person who would have been studying, and engaged in spiritual religious practice for quite some time, like to be really engaged and lit up by this totally new thing. And as you say, naturally, culturally, Japan will integrate, right? Yeah. We'll say, okay, this makes sense. I'm happy to take that into in this part, not so much, but these pieces. So yeah, how interesting to think about what that integration actually looks like. And to have the answer to the mystery of why is there this rumor that he was the president of a Christian university, right? Well, it turns out it wasn't a Christian university. It was a Christian primary school that he was the administrator.
There was a Christian women's college as well.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay,
so
there was two.
That he ran as well. So, I mean, he was pretty involved.
Yeah. So
and I saw some research and it said that they only employed Christians at these schools. But then Hawaii Takata said that after he'd done the 21-day meditation on Mount Kurama, that he then had more interest and leaning into the Buddhist philosophy. We don't know the full story, but it's pretty interesting. And it's nice to see. And I think, yes, it is interesting to understand more about Japan, obviously, because he's Japanese and he has at his base all this Japanese culture that just is organic, is natural and normal for him and in his life. And yet for us, it is something new, and it's a bit like him and Christianity, possibly. For us, it's new and interesting. And yeah, so.
Good stuff. The story continues.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for bringing this little piece. I am a historian by training, and so these little pieces are so intriguing, and the tapestry that they weave, where we only have some of the threads, and then our imagination fills in other pieces, and it's always so interesting to bring these things together and to hear these firsthand and secondhand accounts of people who had more direct connection to the way in which this system of practice was developed in its time. So, friends, we would love to hear from you in the comments. What do you think about your experiences in Shoden and Okuden, Reiki 1, Reiki 2? Do you agree with us that 1 and 2 create a complete practice? Are you surprised by anything that you learned about Reiki's origins in this conversation? And what more are you curious about when you think about the history of the development of the system of Reiki and the many people whose hands it passed through? We would love to know. Let us know down in the comments. There will be links to the articles that we've been talking about in that show description. And stay tuned for more. We have got a new Radiant series coming in the new year. We'll be sharing more about that as it takes form. So stay tuned. Join us again. And until next time, we love you. Goodbye.
Bye.